Previously on agentpalmer.com, Jim Henson the biography is a beacon of positivity, just like Jim. The Old Guard is wonderful, but don't watch the trailer first, and I will never tire of listening to Andrew Belling's Wizard Score, especially now that I know more from behind the scenes. This is the Palmer Files, episode 24 with me again? Yes, this is my second solo episode, but it's about something that I've been mentioning occasionally since the first few episodes. This is a remastering of the capstone project that helped me graduate with a Bachelors in Communications from Keystone College. Let's do the show! Hello and welcome to the Palmer Files. I'm your host, Jason Stershic, also known as Agent Palmer, and on this 24th episode is the world premiere of my remastered college capstone project titled To Change Your Luck. The syllabus for the course that this project came from states that the goal was, quote, aimed at providing students with the opportunity to demonstrate both critical and creative thinking skills and the research capabilities that they have acquired as professional studies, communication, arts, and humanities majors, unquote. Now, I pitched 3 potential projects. The first was an advertising and PR campaign for the college itself. The second was a radio script, and the third was a manuscript based on my Israel journals. What you are about to hear is what was approved, which was a combination of the last two, a radio script based on my high school semester abroad in Israel, from which much of the details you will hear were based on paging through the daily journal I kept while I was over there. My abstract on the project was, quote, to write and produce a 60-minute radio program about a trip I took to Israel that helped me to grow. In this program, I hope to pass along the wisdom of a Jewish proverb that sometimes, to change your luck, you need to change your location. Unquote. Now, in typical me fashion, at least me at the time, perhaps it's persisted, I'll have to think on that, I based the initial script on a paper I had previously written my sophomore year. It told the story much more succinctly and needed to be expanded upon, but at least I had already done the heavy lifting in a sense. Now, I would have loved to have presented you with the original, but I used a bunch of music I had no rights to use, and what's more astounding is that I don't have a clean vocal-only track of all the digital versions I still have access to. So, what you are about to hear is part remaster and part remix. I re-recorded the entire thing within 98% word-for-word accuracy. I know at least one word I somehow left out, and I'm sure I may have missed another, perhaps. Also, it's a remix with completely new music provided by the very talented and amazing Henno Heider of Monkey Tongue Productions, who is also responsible for my usual intro and outro music. Why do I even comment on the accuracy? Because the script I used was not remastered. Unlike the part where I re-recorded my audio of the script and included new music, the script was literally the same one, which was helpful as some of the direction notes I wrote on it were still helpful this time around. But some of the writing was hard to read because my style has changed since then, but since the script was original, I felt it kept this remastering a bit more authentic. So, before I get into it, remember that if you want to discuss this episode as you listen or after, you can tweet me at Agent Palmer, you can tweet the show at The Palmer Files, or email thepalmerfiles@gmail.com. Don't forget, you can see all of my writings and rantings on agentpalmer.com. Now, I will obviously be talking more about this on the other side, but for now, sit back and enjoy the journey. It's a very amazing thing that happens when you notice some little detail about your life now, and your head begins to spiral, and you think of one particular moment in your life, not too long ago, where had you chosen another path, your life would be drastically different. I have had such a moment. I was drinking Fanta, an orange soda, my drink of choice when I was in Israel, and it sent me on an amazing journey that had me reliving the past few years of my life. Let me tell you the story of how these past few years have changed my luck and the course of my life forever. It was an average November, and I was grinding my way through another year of high school. That particular year, I was a junior, and I had very little ambition, except the ambition to prove my teachers wrong when I felt that they neglected to challenge me. I walked into English class at 10 a.m. as I normally did, and that day, like most days, our teacher decided to give us an assignment. So after school, I took a look at the guidelines and processed, in my opinion, an amazing paper. The next day, I handed it in and forgot about it, until a week later when it was graded and handed back. When the teacher put my assignment on the desk, it looked as though a red pen had exploded on it, which was normal for my papers. I like comments and I take everything about my writing seriously. However, the red ink on this paper, with the exception of grammatical errors, was highly offensive. The ink on this paper was telling me that my religious beliefs were wrong. This I didn't appreciate too much, so I approached my teacher after class that day and for several days afterward, always asking her why these comments were being made. She ignored the real issue and told me that she wouldn't change my grade. I couldn't believe what she was doing. She was talking about something as trivial as a grade when I wanted answers about the questioning of my beliefs. After a few more failed attempts to get through to her, I took the paper to my parents for their advice on the situation. They looked it over for quite a long time and then decided that they would prefer to consult our rabbi before taking any course of action. So Friday night, while at temple for Sabbath services, my parents gave our rabbi a copy of the paper with the offensive comments so that he could look it over. At that, they arranged for a meeting on the next day to discuss what his thoughts were. I remember that Saturday very well. For one thing, it was early December and it was cold. My father had set up our parlor and turned on the gas fireplace so that when we all sat down with the rabbi, the room reeked of gas. But the gas would soon be forgotten. The first thing the rabbi did when he sat down was ask me a series of questions about drugs, alcohol, maturity, responsibility, and various other things. From my answers, which were all truthful, he told my parents that I was a very good and self-sufficient kid, along with some other observations that had me beaming with a smile before he even got to my paper. When he finally got there, he said that he could tell I was a little confused as to where I fit into the system of Jewish beliefs, which was correct. I wasn't completely sure how the practices of Judaism fit into my life. He also said that I needed to leave my high school, for he felt that I was not being mentally challenged enough to get anything more than a piece of paper at the end of my high school years. This being something that I agreed with because I felt the same way. The next thing he did was quote from a Jewish proverb. Sometimes, in order to change your luck, you must change your location. With that said, he asked me if I would like to go to Israel. Before I could answer, he explained that being the head of all youth programs for the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, he was in charge of an upcoming trip to Israel for high school students. By now, I was trying not to mentally pack my bags. But after I asked him a few questions about the trip, which he said was 4 months in duration and left on February 1st, I said yes. Now, I always knew that words could change lives, but I never could have imagined the next 6 months. It was only the beginning of December, but the shock of leaving the country, my friends, and my family behind stayed with me every day that passed between my answer to the rabbi's question and the day of departure. 1 week before departure, I was heading in and out of school for the last time as a junior at Honesdale High School. I had no idea what lay ahead of me. All I knew was that I didn't have to put up with that English teacher or anyone else in that school for an extended period of time. And for that, I was thankful. Because I knew I would probably be challenged in some way, shape, or form, at least from being in a new place. Being in that new place, and seeing life in a new way, is a great way to learn. Each day that went by that last week was just time for me to pack up my things for the journey. And each time I placed a folded shirt and pair of pants into my bags, I simultaneously packed an apprehension and assurance into my head, focused on the grand journey that lay before me. 48 hours before my flight departed, there was a gathering of friends and family at my house to wish me well. For me, it was the culmination of the events that had taken place from the moment that I wrote my essay. For everyone else, it was a chance to say goodbye. As I got up on the day of departure, I was feeling quite fine as I walked down the street to the local mom and pop store to buy 2 Mountain Dews for my travels ahead. When I returned to the house, I walked through it for memory's sake. I was semi-aware of the fact that the next time I set foot in the house, I would be a different person than I was that day. That last go-through reminded me of the times I walked through my house before I went away to summer camp for a month. It reminded me that even after 4 short weeks away from the house, it looked different, or at least seemed different when I returned, because of the experiences that I had away from the house. I wasn't sure what my house would look or feel like when I returned from 4 months of the new experiences that I would have across the Atlantic. That day, the person walking through the house was very arrogant. It was at this point in my life that I was not going to deal with failure. Everything that I had to do had to be a victory. Everything. I was disengaged with much of what was around me, and I had very little focus, partly because I did not feel I was being given a real education that would suit the intellectual juggernaut that was me. Not to mention that I got my kicks from my own sophomoric remarks in what was my favorite hobby, debate. I wasn't sure how much of this would change. In fact, I wasn't sure how I would grow as a person from the trip. All I knew was that I was going to a different place, with different people, and I knew something would have to give, them or me. At the airport, I met and became acquainted with some of the 60 other people I was going with. We were told that there would be a brief orientation before boarding, and I asked my parents to stay. They needed to leave, but I convinced them to stay for the orientation. In all honesty, I begged them to stay, because I was afraid and thinking of backing out, though I didn't tell them that. However, after a long, drawn-out orientation comprised of long speeches from people we didn't know about the rules and the pride they had in us, we were pointed towards the terminal. I hugged my parents and bid them farewell one last time. I was herded with the others from my trip into the terminal. There, squished with other passengers on the flight in a small corridor, like sardines in a can, I found myself standing next to Ben, the son of a rabbi from Connecticut. Ben and I started to talk. Where are you from? What kind of music do you like? What are you looking forward to? That kind of stuff. Ben liked rock music, as did I, and so as we stood in the long, narrow corridor, we talked at length about rock music, then moved to sports, and I realized that Ben and I would become great friends before the end of the trip. On the plane, I met some more of the other people that were on the trip with me, and about 4 hours into our 12-hour flight, I grabbed a composition notebook and started a journal. I wasn't sure how long it would last, because every other journal I had ever started only lasted a few days, but I figured if it worked out, I would thank myself later. We landed shortly after dusk in Tel Aviv, and then got on a bus for Jerusalem, our home away from home for the next 4 months. When we arrived at Beit Shmuel, the designated youth hostel where we would be staying for most of the trip, we went onto the roof for a kiddush and other prayers. Beit Shmuel is no more than 800 meters from the Old City, and the walls of Old Jerusalem were lit up. It was a beautiful sight. The lights made the walls seem more ancient than they were, though at that time I didn't realize the historical significance of those stone walls, protecting those people who lived inside of them. We were given our roommate assignments, and then we put our stuff in our rooms and headed down for a bite to eat. My roommates were Arik and Ben, the same Ben I was talking with in the narrow terminal. Arik, who had visited Israel before, was from Southern California and gave us some pointers about the Holy Land. Amid all of our differences, we became great friends, talking late into the evening about everything from girls to religion to the logic and limits of trust. At times, we talked about our assignments, but mostly we just liked hearing the different points of view the 3 of us had about topics. Whether we agreed or not, we discussed and debated it all. All of this from one sip of a drink that I haven't had since I was last in Israel. So what more could I do but take another sip, and I drifted back into more memories of my adventures. Riding on a tour bus was how I saw some of the Holy Land, of which I wrote in my journal, "It's speechless. It's amazing. I cannot say a thing. The beauty is unreal. It's all that I can feel. We traveled every latitude and longitude of Israel, from the Golan to Eilat and everywhere in between. In the Golan, we saw the green grass as it was meant to be seen. We walked on the elevations of land that might someday be given or negotiated away. In the Galilee, we saw great vegetation on the shores of a beautiful sea set in the middle of rolling hills, and more green grass on which we played ultimate frisbee and football. In the desert, we climbed Masada and saw the beauty as we overlooked the Dead Sea and its shores, white with deposits from the salt. In a little town north of Tel Aviv, we met up with a group of Jewish youth from a program called March of the Living, where we had a barbecue and danced with them among old and decaying ruins from civilizations long since abandoned. In the middle of the country, we dug in the soil for artifacts linking us to our past. It seemed I was looking at the passing scenery through the tinted glass windows of a tour bus. However, I'm not complaining. For within those tinted windows, I forged some very strong friendships. All in all, we were a bunch of some 60-odd strangers when we met at the airport terminal for departure, and we formed into a family, strengthened by every challenge we overcame. One such challenge came in the form of crushed matzah, as we hiked from the Sea of Galilee to the Mediterranean Sea. During the hike, we were split up into smaller groups so that we could travel at our own pace. It just so happened that our hike was during the celebration of the Exodus known as Passover. Because of this, we hiked with kosher for Passover food that included matzah, a dry, cracker-like food. No matter whose turn it was in the group to carry the matzah on any given day, it was a given that person was bound to stumble and crush the matzah. Crushed matzah aside, it was an amazing journey that took us 3.5 days and brought our groups together because we had to cook and camp on our own. Another challenge was in the form of an army uniform when we spent a week on a military base. We learned some of the basic mental and physical skills necessary to succeed in the Israeli army. Doing the obstacle course and learning Israel's history from a military view was one thing, but just being on the military base and seeing the pride that everyone had in being there was just an amazing thing to see. We also learned that waking up at 5:20 a.m. to run the 1.5 miles to breakfast while you're half asleep is not fun. But we got through it because of each other. Some of us may have wanted to be elsewhere and not in the army, but we were there, and we did our best, as we knew other Israeli youth would have to do upon their graduation from high school. The army experience prepared us for a lot of the challenges that we had yet to face. At this point, we had all of the confidence we would need to experience a few days and nights in the Negev desert. These were made easier, knowing that we had overcome adversity as a group. The desert was beautiful. It was pure, mostly untouched by the human technologies of electricity and pollution. At night, because of the remoteness of the desert, we were treated to more stars than we knew existed. But on our last hike back to the bus, one of our madricha was informed of some very bad news. A madricha, or madrich, is a counselor who watched over us like big brothers and sisters during the trip. Once we got on the bus, we drove for a while, with the air conditioning to cool us down, and then pulled over just before sunset on the desert. I was sure that the beautiful sunset, which was imminently approaching, wasn't why we had pulled over. Our head madrich gathered all of us and gave us the horrible news. I wasn't entirely sure I heard him correctly. I think he said that someone's mom died. That was way too much to handle. I walked off by myself for a bit, trying to gather pieces of lucid thought, but it felt like I was running to catch the pages of an unstapled manuscript in the grasp of a great tornado's gusts. Grasping what I could, I realized that there were 60 other members of my family, just as full of pain and questions as myself. I also realized that I had recently had some conversations with strangers in a bar about life and death the night prior to our leaving the stone streets of Jerusalem. It was a habit of mine, albeit a bad one. I walked into bars and sat down with a beer, scotch, or some other drink and proceeded to talk to strangers. Sometimes I got their names, but names come and go. But what I remember is the important stuff. I remember getting into the same debates I had in class with these strangers, such as whether Israel should be a Jewish nation or a nation of Jews, or which political party should be in charge of Israel's future. They were nice and as respectable as they were respectful, unlike in American bars, making it easy to communicate and open up to them. I may have been 30 or 40 years their junior, but they still treated me as an equal. In turn, I gave them the opportunity to teach me, or at least enlighten me with some of their opinions, biblical, historical, cultural, anything. And sometimes, if they really got me thinking, I'd buy them a drink to thank them for sharing a little bit of knowledge and themselves with me. I guess, looking back, I miss that a lot. Walking into bars and talking to strangers that are just as, if not more, thirsty for your conversation than the drink in front of them. It was in the bars of Jerusalem that I learned many lessons that were supplemented by or supplemented those that I learned in the classroom. Learning in the bar by talking to different people gave me a better grasp of the variety of the different aspects and opinions of the Jewish religion. I also learned in a 3-hour core class. The curriculum covered 4,000 years of Jewish history, the people, the land, and the culture in 4 months. For the most part, I learned a lot of things about all aspects of Judaism on the trip, like the importance of Israel as a state and the history behind the lands that I traveled upon. Because of this, I came to appreciate how historically rich Judaism is. The reason we learned so much about Judaism was because of the different perspectives we got from the discussions we had in class. Our core class was commonly split in two, because of the two sides that often appeared during most of the in-class disagreements: modernist or traditionalist. Billy, who liked to be called Shamir, and Rachel were the two heads of the class faction of traditionalists. Erica and I were two heads of the modernists faction. Of the traditionalists, Shamir was the leader. He was from California and told those of us in the modernist camp many times that we were wrong. Rachel did most of her talking off of things that Shamir said. On the other side, I was the leader of the modernists and Erica had my back. At times, Rachel and Shamir seemed to parody Erica and myself. In the middle was the rest of the class, most tending to lean towards the modernist point of view, because they could relate to it more easily, being mostly liberal in thought anyway, but not as extremely modernist as Erica or myself. The 4 of us, Shamir, Rachel, Erica, and myself, were very capable of turning a 3-hour class into a 3-hour debate, or heated discussion, as we like to call them. But in that forum, how can one learn? In that forum, one can learn easily. Enter our core teacher, Tamar. She understood that if we were discussing our lessons, we would be forming thoughts and opinions rooted upon the facts that she fed us. So that is what she did. Tamar would start off the class explaining a situation or period in time of the Jewish religion, and then she would eventually come to a place where the discussion could start. From there, Shamir, Rachel, Erica, and I knew what to do. And as the discussion moved along, Tamar would throw out more information on one side or the other in order to give us more to think about, more to debate about, and more to learn. There was one other special thing about core class. It was one of the most important aspects of the trip. Therefore, the trip was built around it, and usually, once a week, we would wake up early and take our core notebooks onto a bus and go somewhere. Many of the journeys we engaged in, otherwise known as tiyuls, were educational in nature, and for the most part, if we went to a Crusader castle, we would learn about the Crusades and take notes and, yes, have our heated discussion. We had those discussions all over the country, from our classroom in Jerusalem to the shore of the Mediterranean, to Masada, to the Dead Sea, to the Sea of Galilee, to Tel Aviv, and everywhere in between. Aside from the in-class lessons and my out-of-class discussions, we had a supplementary book, James A. Michener's The Source, from which some of our essays were written. I neglected to read this book aside from the assigned chapters, and because of this, I feel that I negated some of the lessons I could have learned. However, I did learn more than just Judaism. I learned about the hard-working life of those who live on a kibbutz from actually being there and working with them at Kibbutz Lotan in the Arava Valley of the Negev Desert, where residents live and work together under the slogan, "Where desert and spirit come together." I learned about the army from actually being there, which is a part of every Israeli's life. And I learned about belief from seeing it in the eyes of everyone around me in the holy city of Jerusalem. Walking through the old city, walking through the new city, whether I passed a Hasidic Jew or a Jew in a Metallica shirt, it didn't matter how deep their level of commitment to the religion was. All that mattered was that they were Jewish, and so was I. One example of having just Judaism in common with someone was exemplified at the Tzedakah, or community project that I did, where I helped mentally challenged adults in a shelter in Jerusalem known as Magen David. There, most of the residents didn't have much contact with any of their relatives, and there was no common language. Some spoke Russian, others German, Italian, Hebrew, or any other language you can think of, but just our presence and our help in doing activities with them or singing songs to them brought smiles to their faces, and that was very gratifying for all of us who were there. At the Kotel, also known as the Wailing Wall, I saw the faces of Jews in prayer, Jews in army uniform, and Jews in study. All of this has had a great impact on my individual faith. I am thankful to have been in the places that I have been. This experience was amazing. Unfortunately, or fortunately, it had to come to an end. I remember sitting in the airport awaiting the boarding call for our flight. The family that we had become had only 13 hours left together. I remember thinking, whatever happens to us after this will happen to us as individuals. But we will never forget what has happened to us these past 4 months, and we will never forget each other, Israel, or the meaning of Judaism. On the plane, after an hour or so, I took out my journal and paged through 2.5 composition notebooks with detailed entries for every day of those past 4 months. The ink from my last entry was still moist, as were my eyes as I turned to my very first entry. I still have a vivid remembrance of exactly how I was feeling when I wrote it down, and I think that I always will, for I knew that that was the moment when my life and my luck changed forever. And I was aware that when the plane landed, we would see our old lives for what they were. We were different people now, in faith and personality, in experience and maturity, and our friends and families would notice the difference in who we had become. I did not know what the future would hold at that moment, but I knew this experience would never leave me. Before the plane landed, I shed many tears with my close friends, and I kept paging through my journal, looking at the entries and remembering what it was like when I ran around the old city of Jerusalem with Freya on a cool spring night when the stars were out and the moon led us places no other light shone, and what it was like shooting an M16 in the army, feeling the gun kick back into my shoulder as I shot at the target some 50 meters away. As I paged through, the memories piled up and the tears just kept coming. As the time of arrival at Newark came closer, we were all up and moving around the cabin of the plane. Not just to say goodbye to people, but to relive memories with them in their company. A benefit not many of us would have once the plane landed and we all went our separate ways. Wherever they were to take us, we knew that we always had shared experiences that none of us would soon, if ever, forget. What came to be after I came back from my adventures in the Holy Land was culture shock. The shock of how unopened and self-oriented everyone in America is. I never experienced culture shock while I was over there. But when I came back, it hit me like a 30-ton truck with no brakes going down Mount Everest. It was in the bars that I couldn't even enter. It was in the public transportation that I tried to avoid taking, though in Israel, it was my preferred way of travel. Because public transportation is safer over there, or at least it seemed that way. It was also in sports. Over in Israel, they have a national soccer team and a national basketball team. Everyone pays attention to the teams when it is their season, and there is not much of an interest in how much money a certain player makes, just that these players represent Israel. Even before I could try to shake off the culture shock, I was faced with the task of finding a place to complete my high school education. Before I left Israel, my principal Baruch had a meeting with me and told me that if I wished to be as successful as I was in Israel academically, then I was better off not going back to my high school. Seeing as how I had just had a college-like experience, I decided to see what was out there. Fortunately, I found that I could complete my high school education and get a jump on my college degree at Keystone College. 3 days after an interview with Keystone's Vice President of Admissions, I received an acceptance letter, and 2 months later, I was attending classes at the college itself. During those 2 months, life was a blur. I have very little recollection of the actual transitions that may have occurred in my being those first few weeks or even those first 2 months back from Israel. All I know is that I had a hard time reacquainting myself with some of the people that I used to know. It was a difficult time for me because, as much as this place I returned to was my home, I had developed a relationship with Israel that rivaled that of what I had at home when I left. Therefore, when I returned, my home didn't feel like my home, making it both easier and harder to move right into a residence hall on the campus of Keystone College. My first year there was one that had quite an influence on me. I made friends and tried to adapt myself back to America, though I was now in college, which is a completely different American environment than I was used to even before I left. Needless to say, my freshman year was a learning experience. During my second semester at college, I celebrated the 1-year anniversary of my departure to Israel with a 45-minute trip home to look over my journal from the trip. I opened one of the journals and went right back to the steak dinners that I loved so much. I found myself lost in a memory, walking from Beit Shmuel to the Blues Brothers Steakhouse with the guys and sitting at our regular table, receiving an appetizer, salad, steak, potatoes, dessert, and drinks, all for 40 shekels each, the equivalent to $10 apiece, a great deal we had made with the owner because we frequented the place so often. After that semester was over, and I had 1 year of college behind me and a high school diploma in my hand, I celebrated the 1-year anniversary of my return from Israel. This celebration was a bit different. I began to realize that there was still more to be learned about Judaism and about myself. So, I sat down and picked up the source, read it from start to finish, and then became frustrated with myself for not reading it while I was in Israel. You see, it was great to know that some of the places Mishner talked about were places that I had been, but to know that I could have been there while I actually was reading the book, that would have been amazing. After summer, I went back to school and had a great semester. Realizing that I was supposed to be a freshman, although I was actually a sophomore, gave me more incentive to be the mature person that I had become upon my return from the Holy Land. During my second semester, while walking in a little grocery store not too far from campus, I saw the most remarkable sight. I saw a 12-pack of Fanta. Needless to say, I bought it and took it back to my room, where I popped open a can and this entire fantastic voyage began. It amazes me that I'm here now, because I had the ambition to challenge a teacher who wronged my faith. It amazes me that my course of action from that one little event has bumped me 1 year ahead in education and 1,000,000 years ahead in my beliefs. Reflecting back on my experience in Israel and my early entry into college, I can see many lessons learned. Sophomore year at Keystone was one that directly relates to my experiences in Israel. The program that took me to Israel was for young Jewish leaders, although I usually downplayed the leadership aspects of my trip. The sheer magnitude of my involvement in student leadership on campus was most likely in direct relationship with the various aspects of leadership that I had learned in Israel. However, there was one lesson left to learn, and that was learned during my sophomore year. Anyway, I was the president of the campus activities board, president of the radio club, a member of student senate, a member of interhall council, a member of commuter council. I wrote volumes for the school newspaper, and oh yeah, there were some 12-plus committee and other organizational involvements dealing with issues from campus safety to accreditation that I had on top of my actual schoolwork. Israel, though I didn't know it at the time, prepared me to become not a good, but a great leader. In Israel, I learned to interact and communicate well with lots of different individuals, which helped me to accomplish a lot my sophomore year, as well as do a lot and do a lot effectively. Because I had more confidence to try new things. With that confidence came the allowance to be open to failure, if it should happen. Failure also serves as a good example of what not to do. For instance, I wasn't just writing an article here or there for the paper. I was writing about 6 or 7 per issue. I wasn't just the president of the campus activities board. I attended and assisted in the presenting of 90% of the activities that were on campus that year. Let's just say there was one thing missing: the ability to say no. That I learned in retrospect after my sophomore year, when I realized that there was more in saying no than in saying yes in some situations. A lesson that I didn't learn in Israel, though I found the opportunity to learn that lesson because of my Israel-inspired involvements. Another lesson that came full circle that year was my realization of how teachers can effectively motivate me when I am otherwise uninterested. In Israel, my world history teacher Ephraim and I never really saw eye to eye. For most of the class, he saw that for whatever reason, I wasn't living up to my potential. In order to motivate me, he actually confronted me angrily and hurt as he yelled at me, explaining how I was wasting my potential. That did the trick. And from then until the end of my time in his class, I did better to meet his high expectations of me. Needless to say, 2 years later in a math class at Keystone College, the same thing happened with my algebra teacher, Wes. It was after the first test, which I aced, that I decided not to focus much attention on the class. The second and third tests proved to Wes that I needed to put more energy into the class, but even after a few casual talks, the fourth and fifth tests were no better. Late in the semester, Wes let loose and yelled with the same anger and hurt that I saw in Ephraim, and that helped me to come to the realization that I needed to focus more on algebra. It wasn't necessarily because of the grade, as was the case with Ephraim. It was because these teachers were trying to teach me something, and I was denying them the right to get through to me. Understanding that as a student, in any aspect of the word, means that you are giving the right to a teacher to educate you is a great lesson to have learned at that time in my life. That year was a great example of how I kept learning lessons based on the concepts that I was taught in Israel. Lessons that I was able to learn in retrospect, because I didn't just forget the trip and move on with my life. I kept remembering lessons that I had learned while in Israel, and I applied that knowledge in addition to what I was learning in the classrooms and dormitories and on the grounds of Keystone. Looking back, sophomore year was the time that some of my lessons came full circle. It was also during that year that I started to get back in touch with some of the people that I went to Israel with. Not for any reason in particular. It was more like when you just call up an old friend, because his name popped into your head one random day and you were ambitious enough to pick up the phone or write him a letter. One person that I got in touch with was my friend Donnie, who, at the time, was going to college somewhere in California where he had a radio show on which he talked and debated about Israel. Having the internet allowed me to listen, and I even called in once. That was just a continuation of my fantastic voyage that hasn't stopped. That was the year that I got by on my leadership skills, from which I am in debt to my Israel experience for honing. That was the year that I first started to realize that I had the opportunity to make my experience at Keystone just as memorable as that of which I had in Israel. However, I did go overboard, which served as a great lesson in how to stretch oneself extremely thin. Regardless of how it happened, I made it through my sophomore year at college without stepping down from any of my positions. I did this because I was able to pull all-nighters almost at will, and for all of the sleepless nights that year, none compares with the night in Israel that I stayed up doing homework with friends and then was blessed to see the sunrise over Old Jerusalem. I remember how that particular day started. I had an early wake-up for tefillah, a morning service, and then I dozed off in Hebrew class. In core, after a snack and some coffee, we had a good discussion on Jewish leaders, free will, and the importance of Israel as a state. That was also the day that my core class came to the realization that all in our class were gaining more respect and acceptance for one another. As the debates and discussions got hotter and hotter, we were all getting more and more emotionally involved. During lunch, I received a letter from my parents containing an article that was written about me in the local paper. The article reminded me as to the reasons that I was sent on this magnificent journey. After lunch, I had a meeting with Baruch, the principal, to check up on how I was doing. He did that from time to time with all of us. In the meeting, I showed him the article, and we discussed all of the opportunities we have to learn. Then I took a walk to Ben Yehuda Street so I could clear my head before getting back to my room to do some massive homework, including an essay on Israel, a Jewish state or a state of Jews. When I returned, I ran into David, one of our counselors, and we discussed what 3 books or movies or albums would you have with you if you were stuck on a desert island. After the conversation, I ran across the street to pick up some Beasley, a crunchy snack, and some Pepsi Max to help me create my paper. With the Pepsi and Beasley, I started writing. It was getting late, and Ben had fallen asleep long ago, but Arik was writing his paper and Jake had come over to work on his. We were averaging about a paragraph every hour because we were discussing what we were writing before we wrote it, and by the time we had all finished, it was about 4:30 in the morning. We all decided that we had come this far, why not stay up? So we all took turns taking showers, and around 5:40, we headed up to the roof of Beit Shmuel. It was there, with headphones in all of our ears, U2 blasting in mine, that we awaited the sunrise. When it came, we were not disappointed. Seeing the sunrise over the old city walls was a sight to behold. And even though I have actual pictures of the sunrise, I don't need them to remember the beautiful oranges and purples I saw in the sky, around the fiery sun that we have all seen. Although, before, I had never seen it look that magnificent, and I have never again seen it look that magnificent since. After my sophomore year, I used my ups and downs in Israel to get me through life. If I had a bad day, I would think back to the good times in Israel, or if I had a great day, I would think back to Israel and thank God for allowing me the experience and all the things that followed to get me to this great day. Junior year, I put more focus into my education in the classroom. Out of the classroom, I limited my involvement to the newspaper and a work-study job. The lessons of my sophomore year were well learned. That year was a slow one, and during the weeks or days that dragged on forever, I would pick up my journals from Israel and relive the trip. I was wishing at that time that just reading about and reliving the trip would change my present luck and speed up the day or week. But luck can't be wished or willed. I needed to dig back into the lessons that I learned. I needed to remember how to listen to different points of view, as I did so well in core. I was stuck in first gear, out of neutral, but still far from my potential. Yes, I was doing well in school, but I still felt empty. In Israel, I never felt empty. There was always something to explore or something new to try. Freshman year, I wasn't empty, because one can't be empty when in a new and different place. Sophomore year, there was no emptiness in sight, because I was full to the brim, being extremely busy. Now, in the same old place, new at one time, now just an old pair of shoes, having done almost all there was to do, or at least having taken many of the opportunities afforded to me, I was just there, a junior and empty. It was this emptiness that led me to the realization that Israel was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And that void was a hunger for another experience similar to that of which I had in the Holy Land. An experience that we are all capable of providing ourselves with, so long as we keep our minds open and our eyes looking forward. I was not granted the past 5 years because I sat around and waited for something to come to me. It was not wished or willed for on my behalf either. It was because I took advantage of what was given to me. There is some luck involved in what is given to you, but one must still take the right path and make the right decisions. I took a path less traveled, and it has changed my luck, my life, and who I am. My senior year in college is a great example of how in some ways I have completely evolved as a person, and yet, in some ways, still have a long way to go. For example, before I left, I watched TV as a reason not to do what I needed to. Now, I do what I need to and turn the TV on for educational value and the occasional drama. I still watch sports, but now I watch while I am reading, writing, or doing work. This is an example of how I haven't completely changed the person I was, just how I altered the person I was to improve my life and the lives of those people around me who benefit from my work. It wasn't until I found Fanta that I started to think back on who I was and who I am now, because of the trip and Keystone College. But now, with the rest of my life ahead of me, I look back and remember who I was. I remember being a very arrogant person, which today I am still, but not so much. I remember that I hadn't learned the art of restraint, but now I develop my thoughts. I remember that I didn't pay attention to consequences, whereas now I am selective in what I do because I realize the impact that it will have on the future. I know that then, if I didn't like something, I didn't listen, whereas now I am more open to hearing the truth of life and creating it at times. I realize that it is only in retrospect that we grasp the full experience. And as I have almost begun to fully understand the experiences that I had in Israel, I can now start to grasp the lessons I have learned during my time at Keystone College. In comparison, I spent only 4 short months in Israel and 4 years at Keystone College. Both are major steps, but still just a part of my own personal evolution. I am not done growing or learning. If anything, Israel has taught me that I will always be learning and growing, and Keystone has solidified that lesson. I can only hope to take advantage of the opportunities afforded me in the future, and if I need to change my location to change my luck, I am no longer afraid of that change. Because if Israel and Keystone have taught me anything about the concepts of learning and growth, it's that they can happen anywhere, even in the most special of places. It has also proven to me that the old Jewish proverb, sometimes, in order to change your luck, you need to change your location, holds true. I hope you enjoyed that. The process by which I recorded it this time around was different in many ways, but what is most obvious is that this was kind of a script by committee, and as the original project was completed by me with backing of a committee of 3 faculty members, and I was hoping for a passing grade to graduate, I did take their suggestions under advisement, but now, looking back, some of it is apparent that ideas were not fully thought out. The people I mentioned where they were from, Ben from Connecticut, Arik and Shamir from California, people were from all over. Why did I just single those 3 out? The Fanta detail is nice for a through line to go back and reminisce, but it worked off the original essay titled A Fantastic Voyage, which doesn't really work in audio. And while the inclusion of the 4 years in college works well with the 4 months abroad, the conclusions that I reach are a bit holier than thou for me, even if I was being nice to myself. But I promised a few people behind the scenes that this outro would not become a running commentary on everything that I found difficult or wrong or had issues with in revisiting this project for the sake of this podcast. Why I even considered doing this might come to mind as a question, and well, I have discussed this being my, quote, podcasting, unquote, experience before I even really got into podcasting. Since I hinted at it a few times during the first 20-odd episodes, I decided that it would be a good idea to share it out. Second, and perhaps most importantly, the next few episodes are about friendship, and this experience and even this original project factor into the first 2 of those 4 episodes, so it was important for context. But you'll get that context next time and during those episodes. So what's left to say? Well, I did enjoy revisiting all of this, and while there are circumstances that have changed, I still believe a good chunk of what I originally wrote. I continue to learn. I want to be educated, because what's existence if we're not searching for more knowledge? And with that knowledge may not come complete fulfillment, but it's a start. And what of the Jewish proverb that literally started it all and that I finished the piece with? Well, my anxiety may have a little more influence on where I go, but changing your location doesn't always have to be a physical location. Think on that, won't you? Seriously, think about it. Thanks for listening to the Palmer Files, episode 24. As a reminder, all links are available in the show notes, and now for the official business. The Palmer Files releases every 2 weeks on Tuesdays. If you're still listening, I encourage you to join the discussion. You can tweet me at Agent Palmer. You can tweet the show at the Palmer Files. You can see all of my writings and rantings on agentpalmer.com, and all links will be available in the show notes. Email can be sent to the show at thepalmerfiles@gmail.com if you have any feedback on this or any previous episode, or if there's a topic or guest you'd like me to consider. You can also hear more of me in the meantime on Our Liner Notes, a musical conversation podcast with host Chris Meyer, and my other gig as co-host of the Podcast Digest with Dan Lissette. So I will share a little bit of the original with you, but remember, the quality's not that good, and well, you've probably gotten used to this voice, but, you know, I was younger, and that's... Okay, well, it's not going to be long. Here it is.
It's a very amazing thing that happens when you notice some little detail about your life now, and your head begins to spiral, and you think of one particular moment in your life, not too long ago, where had you chosen another path, your life would be drastically different. I have had such a moment. I was drinking Fanta and orange soda, my drink of choice when I was in Israel, and it set me on an amazing journey that had me reliving the past few years of my life. Let me tell you the story of how these past few years have changed my luck and the course of my life forever.